Hi, welcome to the H4RL Career Podcast. I'm Jill,
And I'm Dave.
and today we're going to talk to you about a problem going on in the world and some careers that are helping to solve it. Because it really is awesome if you can find a career you're interested in that also feels like you're making a difference.
We've actually found that people want to make a difference with their careers. They don't want to just go do a 9-to-5 job and just, earn a paycheck. They actually want to make a difference in the world. And so we decided we're going to do a series on different kind of careers that we're going to try to highlight problems in the world and then talk about people and careers that are working to solve these problems to give you an idea of maybe a field that you never heard of that might spark your interest. So we just want to educate you on why we're doing these things. So we don't know how many of these we're going to do. We know there's actually a lot of problems out there, so we'll start doing that. By the way, if you have an idea for a podcast you want us to cover, a type of problem in a career, please put it in the comments below. We'll check that. Or you guys should go to h4rl.com and go to the contacts tab and just shoot us a quick little email like, hey, try this problem out. Or could you do one on this type of career? We would love to hear from you, and we will try our best to respond to those. But today we're going to focus on the problem of plastic. And by the way, if you find any of this interesting at all, please go ahead and click subscribe, give us 5-star ratings, whatever you can, whatever you're listening to, just kind of help boost our ratings like that. So basically other people would get to see this. Also, you can do the old fashioned way and just tell someone about this podcast because that works just fine.
That would be great.
That'd be great as well. So word of mouth, we're just trying to get that out there. And again, if there's anything you want us to cover, please let us know. All right. With that being said, Jill, what are we going to be talking about today?
Well, I want to mention real quick just that we're not taking a stance on any of these issues
very true.
that we're going to talk about in these podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
We're not telling you, where we stand on this problem in the world or what should be done to solve it, but we're just going to tell you about some current events, things going on, and careers that are involved in saving the world.
Absolutely.
Making a difference in what's going on.
This is all just we're trying to educate people because we actually find out most people pick a career based off of what they know. So we're just trying to expand what you know, what's going on out there in the world. So that's all this is, just educational. Hope you find it interesting and maybe entertaining a little bit. Let's get started.
All right, so plastics are a big deal. I'm sure you've heard about what a big problem they are. And it's a huge problem in the ocean. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And I think we're even going to do a podcast that focuses on that.
Yeah.
But plastics in general are a huge problem. 400 million tons of plastic is produced every year.
That is a lot of plastic.
That's a lot of plastic.
Considering how light plastic is, that is a lot of plastic.
That's true. It's not like 400 million tons of metal.
Right, exactly.
That's a lot more volume to make that weight.
It is.
So a lot of plastic is produced every year, and 40% of that, so almost half, is single-use plastic, which means it can't be recycled. We use it, and then it's just tossed out.
Not good.
That's a real problem for just filling up landfill space. And then there's also the plastics that can be recycled. They take a lot of energy to do that.
Yes.
So even if someone goes to the trouble to recycle that plastic, we go through that whole process, which we all know a lot of times doesn't happen.
Nope.
I mean, I see tons of places where everybody has water bottles and then they all go in the trash. There's no recycling bin. So even of our recyclable plastic, not all of it gets recycled, but then the stuff that does, it still is a huge energy drain to do that. So we're going to talk about today some solutions that are coming up for this. Another problem that happens with our plastic is it gets in our environment.
Oh, yep.
So when it gets into the environment as big pieces, that's a mess. It's trashy. And sometimes like those plastic bags, if they make it their way into the ocean, they blow. You'll see them blowing across parking lots. They make their way into the ocean eventually, and they look like jellyfish. So the sea turtles will ingest those, which does not go well for them. And then as those plastics start to break into smaller pieces, they look like food for more and more creatures. So 1/3 of sea turtles have eaten plastics. Most seabirds have eaten plastics. And then the thing is, it breaks down even further into these tiny little microscopic bits. So everything, including us, is ingesting those.
Yes, you are eating plastic, believe it or not. It's really sad to say, but you
Eating,
are.
drinking, breathing in, like inhaling, because these get so tiny. This plastic is just filling our world. So I think, Dave, you found a statistic. Somebody was saying that we consume a credit card volume amount of plastic every
week.
Every week.
Believe it or not, that's what it said. I did not make this up. They literally said a credit card worth of plastic every week. Believe it if you want to or not. I find it kind of hard, but that's what they said. It was from, I believe, Consumer Reports, which is a pretty trusted
We've got
website.
our notes here. Let's make sure.
Yeah, it's Consumer Reports. So that's a legitimate source. So it's not just some random person typing something online.
Yeah, so it says we eat, drink, and breathe in more than 74,000 microplastic particles every year. 100,000 animals in the sea are killed by plastic every year. So this is a really big problem for our environment and for us.
There's even one stat that I actually find kind of hard to believe, but it was out there by the BBC. So again, another trusted source. They said by 2050, if we don't do stuff to help curtail all this plastic production, that there actually might be more plastic by weight in the ocean than fish, which I find insane and incredibly sad in my personal. That's very sad, because we've all heard about these giant floating continents out there in the ocean. I don't know if you haven't, you should Google it, but there are giant patches of plastic out in the middle of the ocean.
Multiple or just like one enormous
I think it's actually more than one, but for sure one definitely in the Pacific. In the northern Pacific, between the U.S. and China, because there's a giant vortex, like there's a giant current that kind of keeps circling around and kind of gathers up all the plastic that kind of makes its way into the ocean from ocean streams and stuff like that and forms there. Now, we're going to talk about other, like Joe said earlier, we're going to talk about people who are working to solve that problem, but today we're going to talk about the recycling problem, all right? Now, as Jill mentioned earlier, not much a lot of it's single use. It means they just throw it away and they don't reuse it. Only about 10% of the plastics are recycled. That's actually like 9%, actually. That's really, really not good. And the reason for it is because it takes a lot of energy to recycle plastics. Now, let's talk about that a little bit. There's actually, I do a little bit of science here, too. I'm an engineer, so I'll do what I can on these podcasts to give a little bit of background and information. So there are two basic major categories of plastics out there. There's what they call thermoplastics and thermosets. Both are types of plastics, all right? So what a plastic is at its base is actually made from, almost all plastics are made from hydrocarbons, all right? So they come from oil, believe it or not. You get oil and then you refine it and you get out the stuff you're going to make for gasoline and diesel, and you get other byproducts that you then turn into plastics. And a lot of them are called polymers. Polymers means many MERS. MERS are the basic building blocks. So they're all the same type of chemical chain based off the type of plastic you want to make. They have a different base structure, but then they just kind of daisy chain them all together. Thermoplastics are basically, when you look at a microscopic structure of them, they're these long chains of these polymers that's kind of lay on top of each other, like spaghetti. There's laying there, all right? And they're not usually very strong, but they are what you make bottles out of, like water bottles, and Legos are made out of thermoplastics. And the great thing about thermoplastics are they are recyclable.
So Legos are recyclable?
They are recyclable. I actually found a website. I didn't think they were, but someone's categorized them as a thermoplastic, so cool. So those, if you heat them up, you can imagine all those like little spaghettis kind of start to get moving around under the heat, and then all of a sudden you can start to push them and remold them into a new shape. A lot of times you chop them up into small bits and you basically melt them down, and then you put them through another extrusion process and you make a new product out of them, all right? That's the thermoplastics. And about 75% of all the plastics that we make are thermoplastics, which are great. 25% are called thermosets. They're your stronger plastics. These are the stuff that are like, they're more brittle, they're stronger, and they're more like your structural and your industrial type of plastics that you would see out there. What happens is they still are like little polymers. So they're like little chains of MERS, if you want to call them. And they're kind of laying on top of each other, but they have cross links. So they're actually links between these spaghetti strands, all right, that makes them very strong. So once you heat them up, those chemical links get linked, and then they cool them back down, and they're set. Hence, thermoset. And when you heat them back up, they don't come unlinked again. They still keep their links. That's why you can't recycle them. That's a big problem, because all those, it's a one-time use. You can never break them down or reuse them again. So we're not going to talk about those today. We're going to focus on the thermoplastic side of things, but that's definitely a problem, by the way. If any of you find this stuff interesting we're talking about, that you want to help out the future with the plastics, and if you could find a way to recycle thermoset plastics, man, you would make a lot of money, first off, crazy amount of money, and two, you'd solve a big, big problem. All right, so that is a big problem out there that we have not quite found a way to do, basically cheaply and on an industrial scale. But
so who would be solving that problem?
Oh, people, material scientists, big time would be into that, as well as chemical engineers, chemists. Those are the type of careers that we'll be looking at, trying to break down thermosets and to recycle them. So
no advancements really have been made in that yet.
No.
It's waiting on whoever's next.
So again, all this comes from oil, from the ground, and so they refine it, and they take some parts off to make plastic, some parts you make fuel. So that's what's pushing it, by the way. I won't get into all the details, but some people blame big oil for this because they want to push plastics, and they really say that recycling is great and a good way to reuse plastics when only 9% is using it. There's actually legislation by California right now who's actually looking to go and sue big oil companies for pushing something they knew really wasn't achievable as far as like all the recycling they said could be done, and that they basically were doing it to make a profit, to make it seem like it's a more acceptable process to be used. So it's interesting. Again, taking no sides here, but that's kind of what's going on with all that. All right. So now
there must be some sort of political and law careers involved in all
absolutely
that.
Environmental justice, that absolutely would be involved with trying to, go after the big oil to have them pay for this issue, because they want to sell their oil products to people who make plastics, right? They want to do that. They actually want to make plastics, and they know that if everybody really realized kind of how bad plastics are for the environment and that you really can't recycle most of them, then they wouldn't be able to sell as much. There wouldn't be as many people out there willing to buy it as much. So they feel like they're covering this up. This goes back all the way back to 1970s. If you want to get into it, you can look this up right now. I just saw a real quick article. We're all researching for this podcast. That's right. We actually tried to do a decent amount of research for these podcasts for you guys. There's actually some legislation going on. Right. I just know all this all the time. But anyway, so that's what's going on with that. But let's talk about the main the thing we're talking about today. Recycling. So the good news is I found this article. Actually, that's what inspired me, by the way, to do this podcast. Is that I found this article on my own reading. And I was like, hey, that is really cool. So there are some people working on a more efficient way to recycle the thermoplastics. All right.
Okay, so that's 75% of the plastics, right?
Right.
So this is important.
A very specific type of thermoplastics, because again, within each type of plastics, you have a lot of different individuals. You can call them species. They're not really species, but individual different types of plastics. You got your polypropylenes, polyethylenes, polyesters. I mean, there's tons of different types of plastics. But we're going to talk about PET, polyethylene terephthalate. That's a very specific type of plastic that's used a lot of times in like cookie containers, soda bottles, fruit and salad packaging, certain fibers and textiles. All right, so it's a very commonly used type of plastic. What happened was back in the early 2000s, I think in the mid 2007 range, somewhere in there, people realized, wait a minute, there's bacteria growing on these plastics. The world is actually really good at breaking things down, people. I actually work for a company. We design stuff that has to try to survive in lots of different environments. And it's really hard to design something to survive in all environments, because the world, bacteria and fungi are really good at breaking things down. So someone realized there's some bacteria growing on this plastic. It's breaking it down.
So if it's growing on that plastic, it's actually kind of feeding on it.
Right? Exactly. So they're like, I wonder how it's breaking that plastic down. So they looked at it and they studied it. Scientists started researching this and looked at this bacteria is creating an enzyme, this little chemical that goes in there and helps break it down. Like if you are lactose intolerant, you can buy these little pills that help give you an enzyme to break down lactate in your stomach, right? Same principle. This plastic, this bacteria, certain type of bacteria, was creating enzymes to break down these plastics. So they started looking at it more closely, and they realized, well, this is really cool. It can break down this plastic, but it's very kind of specific as far as like the temperature range in which it can operate and the pH levels, all these chemistry terms, guys, in which it can operate. It would never scale up. It also takes a little too long to be used on an industrial scale. That's one thing, is if you ever want to create a solution, it has to be cheap to do, all right? So you have to be able to do something that's easy to implement and makes people money. Otherwise, I don't care how great your idea is, it's just never going to take off, All right, so
it's
wasn't
impractical.
It's impractical. It's never going to scale up to an industrial scale of the system. So
right. Great idea, good start, but make it more practical.
it has
so
to
we
make
can
people
implement
money.
it in a big way.
End of the day, it has to be able to make people money. People are not going to lose money, even to save the world, which is really sad to say that statement right there.
Well, and part of it, though, too, I mean, you have to have the money, right?
Yes.
Like, the money will run out if it's not practical enough.
Absolutely. If you're losing money, eventually you're going to go out of business. So
Right.
it wasn't practical. So some additional scientists, who I actually read this article about from the University of Texas, decided to take, we know this chemical, this enzyme, as the bacteria makes it, can break it down. But is there a way for us to optimize it? Can we find it better? So these enzymes, these little chemical chains, can have mutations to them, like all viruses and things, that they can kind of mutate a little bit as that bacteria changes. So they looked at it and they thought, well, there's a lot of different, what they call permutations. Big word, means a lot of different variations of this enzyme. Lots of them. And each way it kind of mutates or changes its structure, the chemical chain, it will attack the plastic differently. But there were so many combinations. I think there were like 19,000 possible different combinations out there. So what they did is they got together with people from the machine learning, the artificial intelligence world, all right?
AI.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, we can't sort through all this information ourselves. This is too much for humans. So what they did is they fed all these different permutations that this enzyme could be, in all the different ways, using their chemistry and chemical models, how those different types of permutations might attack that plastic, and fed it into a computer. 19,000 different scenarios. And the computer just ran through that really quick. That's what machine learning and artificial intelligence is really good at, looking at huge data sets and finding patterns. And they put in there what they were trying to optimize for. They were trying to say, well, we want something that could be quick to break this down, and they wanted to be able to operate with a certain temperature range to make it easy and scalable for industrial use and do it quickly. So they went through all these things. They came out with two out of like these 19,000 combinations, 2 that kind of fit their criteria. So they said, well, okay. They went and made those enzymes in the lab that met those permutations that the computer said, and they tested it out. And lo and behold, the computer was right. Again, the computer was just solving the problem that the people gave it. So the scientists had to figure out, what was the right reactions and the right type of chemistry and all that stuff. The computer didn't figure that out. The people had to figure that out. The computers ran the thousands and thousands of simulations to figure it out. That's the difference.
Yeah, that's a good example of how AI can be used.
Very much so. Very helpful. And they did it, and it worked. It's like, wow, these researchers from the University of Texas were published in Nature. Now, for those of you who aren't really into the science community, Nature is a very, very prestigious scientific journal. Basically, only the biggest scientific discoveries get put into that journal. And it's peer-reviewed. That means other people look at your work and make sure that you did your work correctly. And they will call you out big time if you did not do your work correctly. So it was peer-reviewed, and they said, yep, they're right. They found this enzyme. They call it FAST-Ease. Now, they did the FAST stands for something, but basically an enzyme that can break down these plastics. And within a pretty broad temperature range, under 50 degrees C, so it doesn't take much thermal energy to heat it up.
And 50 degrees C in Fahrenheit is...
It's 120 degrees F, so that's cool for an industrial scale. So that's within the, you don't have to put a lot of energy into it to heat it up again. So that's what made it very viable. Now what they're going to start looking at is like, how does it work with all the different stuff you can find in recycling? Not the pure PET, but let's say you have a little bit of like pop residue on there, right? Soda pop or food or stuff like that. Stuff you're going to find in the real industrial environment.
And even often they have a label on the plastic or something like that made of a different material.
So now you got to do all these tests to figure out how well does this enzyme work when you don't have ideal lab conditions, right? Which is what you need to scale something up for the real world. But the great thing is they think it has promise. Now,
that's so exciting.
It is exciting. Now, what I love about this particular example is it took people from the chemical engineering background, right? It took people from synthetic biology who understood how to do the mutations on the enzyme, right?
Which I had never even heard of.
Right, exactly.
I didn't know about that field.
Right, it's a biology, cool. But it's also kind of combined a little bit with like molecular genetics and molecular chemistry. So you can know how to like kind of mutate certain types of biological organisms. Again, we're not saying we stand for anything, but I think it's interesting that they can do this. Yeah. And they also combined it also with the computer artificial intelligence side of things. They took all three disciplines to come together to solve this problem. Which, by the way, people, that's actually how the toughest problems in the world get solved, is working together as a team with a lot of different disciplines. So it's not too surprising, but I think it's pretty cool.
It takes so much knowledge and so many different strengths.
Oh, absolutely. So again, teamwork for sure. And they solve this problem. Now, they have a long way to go to get this before it gets into the industrial scale, but this could be huge because now instead of like 9%, you could have a lot more of those bottles being more, basically recycled, but not nearly as much energy.
Right.
So not only is it more cost effective, but it's also does not as much energy. We can use the energy for other things, like, generate electricity for ourselves, right?
Right. So let's talk about for just a minute, we're talking about what they're doing right now to solve this problem, which is great, that's exciting, but if I'm thinking about this career, I'm like, well, they found it. So what still needs to be done? Why is this still worth talking about when you're choosing a career?
Well, first off, there are literally, I think, hundreds of different types of plastics. And this is good for PET, which is a very common one, which is great. But there's a lot of other plastics that we need to find more efficient ways to recycle. Like I said earlier, thermosets hasn't even been touched, all right? That's a huge field that you need to put a lot of research into, like how can you recycle those? What about these other types of plastic, thermoplastics that are not PET? Are there other enzymes out there? Are there other type of natural ways of doing this? That's what I love, finding nature, right? Like this, the world's great at breaking things down. The world has solved a lot of these problems for us. I think a lot of it's just us finding those solutions out there and
Right.
using it to our best advantage.
Right. If you can find a natural solution that's already there, that's a lot more efficient.
Right, exactly. So I think that's really awesome. So there's tons of research to be put in there, like how do you recycle all these other plastics in this one specific area? And again, chemical engineering, synthetic biology out there, as well as even computer science, by the way. You can go out there and, go into computer science, but still you don't have to be working on like making a new search engine for Google, but you could actually be working on like solving these type of problems, like natural problems in the world, by using machine learning and that technology as well. So if you have that, like you're more prone to computers, but you still have that interest in trying to make an impact in the world, here's a perfect example.
Here's a question for you. So we've been talking more about the research side where they're actually figuring this out. But let's say they realize, okay, yes, this works. It's going to be a great process for this type of, recycling this type of plastic. Then would you have other people, like maybe your industrial engineers and people like that, coming in to figure out how do we make this happen on a large scale?
How to scale up? Well, you'd have process engineers who would come in. Once you figure out in the lab, which I actually work in projects like this, you have scientists in the lab figuring out, okay, what are the necessary steps, like what temperatures and what kind of conditions do you need to make this reaction or this type of process work in a lab. And now you got to take that and scale that up into like a huge plant.
Very different.
Very different. you got people figuring out what size huge like reactors and what kind of pumps and valving and automation and sensors you're going to use to do all that kind of stuff to make this process work.
So who's involved in this now? What kind of careers?
Those are mechanical engineers, some chemical engineers. You got material scientists, because sometimes these things have like high and weird pH levels, so you have to work out, you have to look at like a material compatibility, corrosion issues, big time. A lot of these scale up production. You got electrical engineers looking on the power side, control engineers, software engineers looking at the automation side of things. So to scale something up from a lab to an actual plant is a huge team effort. Tons of engineers. That's where your engineers get involved for the most part, right? The scientists are pretty much in the lab figuring it out. And then
chemical engineers.
Chemical engineers, but usually like PhD level chemical engineers, which I consider to be more scientists. They're in the lab where figuring out the what we call the base science of it. And then to scale that up, that's your engineers. We figure, okay, you got this process. Let's figure out actually how we're going to make it in a big production plant and make it profitable. So you got that side, and obviously the business side as well, to make sure everything comes out to turn a profit. But that's what would be involved with trying to scale something like this up and then putting it out there. So.
All right. So if this sounds interesting to you, any of these careers we've talked about, that's awesome. And you should look into it more.
Especially if you like chemistry, by the way. There's a great field for that.
And I mean a lot more.
Yeah.
You need to learn about the career, but you also need to learn about yourself.
Yes.
And about what's involved in doing that career, becoming a professional in that career, there's a lot involved in making sure
Absolutely.
that these careers that sound kind of cool and interesting are going to be a really good fit for you for the long term. So make sure you visit us at h4rl.com because we have a bunch of resources there all set up to walk you through the process and help you figure that out.
Absolutely. That's the biggest thing. Just because something sounds interesting, you got to find your right part of that team to be in there, right? You might be great at being the person in the lab doing that nitty-gritty work, but maybe you don't want to be that person spending hours and hours in the lab and figuring that stuff out. Maybe you want to be on the engineering side of things and actually scaling that up. Maybe you want to be on this computer side of things and running the simulations. Maybe you want to be on the synthetic biology side. But you won't know that until first off, you understand who you are. Fundamentally, what really makes you tick, your interests, your strengths, and kind of what you have your vision for your life to be. Right. And that's really where our career course really helps you out, all right? We're in there. We'll help you out every step of the way. You can do it on your own time and on your own schedule. But we kind of help you first really understand who you are and kind of figure out what your goals in life would be and then kind of help them marry together. And hopefully we can direct you in an area you find great interest in and you can make an impact in the world if that's what really drives you. So
right. So you can go through and just kind of check out the resources and use it as you see fit, or we've also got an outline in there that shows you how to walk step by step through it, and it's kind of involved if you go through that whole process. So you can even count that. If you homeschool, you can count it for a half credit in high school. Yes. So check it out. There's a free trial so that you can see what's in there.
So I want to encourage you to really, even if you think this is the really sparks an interest in you, it doesn't hurt you to take a little bit of time to really make sure it's the right thing for you before you get in there and go to college and you realize, yeah, I think this is an interesting problem. I want to work on it, but maybe I should have done something a little bit in a different area to help out with this problem. Because by that time, you've already spent some money and probably took classes you won't need. Again, if you have any ideas, anything you want us to tackle, please put a comment down below. Also give us a thumbs up and a 5-star rating as well.
And make sure you subscribe so you can catch the rest of the series.
And tell other people about it, by the way. Word of mouth is also great. So again, until next time, I'm Dave.
And Jill, thanks so much.